Hey there, Year 9, and welcome to another exciting mathematics class. Today we're going to be continuing with our quadratics, and we're going to be using them to solve problems, so let's get into it. Now, today's questions will be word problems. So when we're dealing with word problems, we need to have a strategy. So, step 1, when you have something you're trying to find, we're going to let it be called x. Step 2, we need to write an equation to describe whatever the question is asking. Step 3, once we've created that equation, remember to solve a quadratic, we must have equals 0. And we normally like to have that on the right-hand side. Step 4, we're going to use the null factor law, and hopefully you can remember the null factor law. Remember, we had questions like this. Let's go for something like this. X plus 2 in brackets, 2x minus 3 in brackets equals 0. And remember, when we were trying to solve this using the null factor law, we have two brackets here. They're being multiplied, and we know if we're multiplying two things to get an answer of 0, that one of the parts must be 0. Anything multiplied by 0 equals 0. So we look at the first bracket. Remember our shortcut? If we let x be equal to, the opposite sign to plus 2 is negative 2. From the second bracket, if we let x equal positive 3, but it must be over 2, that's our shortcut to find our solution. So it's plus 3 over 2, which means you could write it like this. You could put a comma if you prefer to put a comma, or you could go x equals minus 2 comma 3 on 2. That's the null factor law, and hopefully you can remember that. So we might have questions like this, where you have, and remember then you're looking at numbers at times to give 5 and add to give 6, so you'd have this, and then you'll null factor law it from there. And there can be even harder ones, and this one's just a made up one, where you've got a number in front of the x, and you're looking for numbers at times to give 15 and add to give 6, and you go through that process. Hopefully you can remember how to do that. So let's continue. Once you've used the null factor law, look at your answers. Sometimes one of the answers makes sense and the other one doesn't. For example, if you're talking about how long a side length on a shape is, it can't be negative. But if you're talking about just picking a number can be negative. So sometimes answers are valid and sometimes they're not. And now you finish off by writing the answer as a sentence if you look at the textbook, but I'm going to tell you I'm not really too worried about step 1 and step 6. If you use x, I'm assuming that you're defining the term. I don't need you to write the sentence answers at the end. I just want to see the working. Alright, let's get into it. Question 1. The distance travelled by an accelerating car is given by a formula, which means this is an easier question because the formula is provided on the first example, where t is the time in seconds, d is the distance in meters. If the distance that we're going to travel is 130 meters, that means d, because d stands for distance, d is 130 meters. So when we look at our information in the question, we know d is 130 and t is what we're trying to find, how long it is traveling for. So our formula is d equals 3t plus t squared, but we know d is 130 for this specific question, so where you see d, you can put 130 in its place. That's now a quadratic because we've got a squared above our t. Let's rearrange it by minusing 130 to both sides. And I'm going to tidy that up a bit. I like to have the t squared first, then the t part, then the number part, and my equals 0 on the right. That is our quadratic. Now this is a simple one. It's a monic quadratic trinomial. We need two numbers at times to give minus 130 and add to give 3. Well, what are those two numbers? Well, those two numbers are going to be plus 13 and minus 10. Let's just double check that. Plus 13 and negative 10. They multiply together to give minus 130, so that's correct. And they add together to give 3. That's also correct. They multiply to give minus 130. They add to give plus 3. So they're the numbers we're looking for. Let's null factor law it. So t would equal negative 13 and plus 10 if we use our shortcut. So how far was the car travelling for? Sorry, how long was the car travelling for? Well, it can't be travelling for negative 13 seconds. That doesn't make sense. Time can't be negative, so the answer is the car was travelling for 10 seconds. And we need to make sure we acknowledge that that's the only valid answer. Let's try the second example. The product, and remember the word product means when you times numbers together. The product of a number and 5 less than a number is 66. Well, we need to write an equation, then find our answers. So I'm going to let the number be a. You could use x, you could use whatever letter you want, and you don't have to write that statement there. I'm not worried about it. But you do need to come up with something like this. So the product means you multiply. So if the number's a times 5 less than a equals 66. So the product of the number a with 5 less than a, 5 less than a is a take 5, has to equal 66. Let's expand these brackets out. So a times a squared, a times minus 5, minus 5a. Now let's minus 66 to both sides. And we now have a monic quadratic trinomial. We need two numbers at times to give negative 66 that add to give negative 5. What numbers times to give negative 66 and add to give minus 5? Well, plus 6 and minus 11. Let's just double check that. Plus 6, minus 11. Times them together and you get negative 66. Add them together and you get negative 5. So they're the correct numbers. We null factor law that now, so the answers are going to be a equals negative 6 and a equals positive 11. Which answers are valid? Both of them, because this just says find numbers. So let's have a look at our solutions here. The number could be negative 6 or it could be 11. Let's just think about that for a moment. If you have negative 6 and you times it to 5 less than negative 6, 5 less than negative 6 is negative 11. We times that together and you get 66, which is what we want. If you started with the number 11 and times it with 5 less than 11, we also multiply that to get 66. So both answers are correct. Our last example. A picture frame has a length that is 6 centimeters more than its height, and an area of the frame is, or the area of the frame is 160 square centimeters. Find the dimensions, so find the length and the height. Rightio. Let's look at it. Well, I'm going to introduce length and height on my diagram. You can just draw a rectangle, you don't have to draw a fancy picture. Now we know the length is 6 centimeters more than the height. So the length we could rewrite as the height plus 6 extra centimeters, because the length is 6 centimeters longer than the height. So to find the length we need to look at the height and add 6 to it. Now because I'm dealing with a rectangle and because the word area is used, I'm going to think about what the area of a rectangle is. It's just length times height. But in this particular question, I'm not going to use length. I'm going to use h plus 6 because the length is h plus 6. Now I can multiply this out because I've got a bracket times by h. So h times h is h squared, h times 6 is 6h. But what's the area? It says in this question the area is 160. So I can put those values in. So the area is 160, h times h, h squared, h times 6, 6h. Now I'm going to subtract 160 to both sides because I want to have a 0. And I might just tidy that up. I like to have the 0 on the right hand side. This is a monic quadratic trinomial. I need two numbers at times to give minus 160 and add to give 6. Well, what are those numbers? 16 and minus 10. Let's just double check that. Plus 16 and minus 10. They multiply to give minus 160, so that's correct. And they add to give 6. That's correct. So that's actually good. That's what I'm after. If I null factor law this question, h equals negative 16 and plus 10. Now what does h stand for? It stands for the height of the picture. Can you have a height of a picture that's negative 16 centimeters? No, you can't, so that answer's nonsense. The height of the picture must be 10 centimeters, so that's the height. Now it does say to find the dimensions. So if the height is 10 centimeters, what's the length? The length must be 10 centimeters plus 6, which is 16 centimeters. So we know the height is 10 and the length is 16. And there's our answer. Well, time for you to do some questions, enjoy the experience and the wonder that is mathematics. Bye for now.